England. The Canaanites, or Phoenicians, employed their command of various monopolies to gain control of the commerce of the entire Mediterranean area. Having established their bases along the shores of the Mediterranean, they found that the most centrally located headquarters for all of their operations was located on the Adriatic Sea. Here they founded the city of Venice, Phoenicia, in 466 AD because of its unique location, and the dedication of the Canaanites to the pursuit of money and power. It soon became the command post of the commercial world. The 1152 census shows some 1,300 Jews in Venice. They paid a tax of 5% on their money-lending operations. They were also active as brokers in commodities. In 1366, they obtained the right to reside in Venice itself. Prior to that date, they had been forbidden to reside in the city, and were confined to living on the mainland in Mestre. They customarily charged from 10% to 20% on loans. Because of Venice's great commercial possibilities, they flocked in from many parts of the world. In 1492, after their expulsion from Spain, many Jews and Marranos settled in Venice. The colony was then divided into three groups: the Germans, known as Tudesci, the Levantini, from the Levant, and the Ponantini, or Westerners. In 1797, the French occupation opened the gates of the ghetto. Napoleon then gained power and established his Italian kingdom, from 1805 to 1814, which gave them further rights. During the Revolution of 1848, Castine reports in his History of the Jews that revolutionary Venice was ruled by Daniel Manini and two other Jews. The Venetians were always known as masters of intrigue. They aided the Turks in the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, which ended the 1200-year reign of the emperors of Byzantium. The Turks were shocked at the rapacity of the Venetians, who carried off much of the city's legendary art treasures, gold, and jewelry. After they had returned home with their loot, the Venetians actively disputed control of the Mediterranean with the Turks, fighting them continually from 1453 to 1718. Venice had now become the headquarters of a ruthless, social-climbing band of entrepreneurs who purchased titles for themselves, or created them out of thin air, built splendid mansions, and collected the art treasures of Europe. They financed their new lifestyle with the enormous sums which they garnered from trade, piracy, and money lending. From the year 1171, this group became known throughout Europe as the Black Nobility, because they were of Canaanite origin, as contrasted to the fair-skinned nobility of the people of Shem. The Black Nobility gradually infiltrated the noble families of Europe. Today, they constitute most of the surviving European royalty. Because of their ruthlessness, the Venetians attained a worldwide reputation as international arbiters of intrigue, revolution, poisoning, and other forms of assassination. They often conspired to bankrupt any opponent, and were known to cruelly rape the daughters of anyone in the oligarchy who dared to oppose them. From Venice, they rapidly spread northward like some new form of plague, setting up businesses and banking establishments in the northern cities of Italy. They bought more titles and intermarried with impoverished families of the old nobility. In Florence, the preeminent family was the de Medicis, who used their wealth to establish an academical which foisted humanism on the world. The de Medici established Florence as the European center of the Black Nobility, or Guelphs, as they were now called. The Black Nobility. The Black Nobility also established close ties with the ruling families of England, through the Savoy and Este families. The Savoys ruled Italy from 1146 to 1945. The Este family ruled Ferrara from the 12th century until Italy was united in 1860. Peter, the ninth Count of Savoy, married his niece, Eleanor, to King Henry III of England, and thereby became his privy councillor. King Henry granted him large estates, with the title of Earl of Richmond. Peter brought in other members of the Black Nobility to marry English noblemen, who included Richard de Burgh and the Earl of Lincoln. Peter's younger brother, Boniface, was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. Peter died in 1268. The founders of the European dynasties which lasted into the 20th century were Rupert, Count of Nassau, who died in 1124, and Christian, Count of Oldenburg, who died in 1167. From Rupert came the Hesse-Darmstadt line, the Hesse-Kassel line, the Dukes of Luxembourg, the Badenborgs, the Prince of Orange and Nassau, and the Kings of the Netherlands. From Christian came the Kings of Denmark and Norway, the Schleswig-Holstein line, and the Hanovers, who became kings of Great Britain from 1717 to the present time. Also of the Black Nobility were the Dukes of Normandy, the Angevins and the Plantagenets, who became the Tudor and Stuart kings of England, the Saxe-Coburgs, and the Wittelsbachs. The Hanover line was always deeply involved with Freemasonry. The Hanovers became kings of England in 1717. That same year, the first Grand Lodge was established in England. The Masons' Company had been established in England in 1376 in London and had obtained a grant of arms from King Henry VIII in 1472. It was incorporated by King Charles II in 1677. But this was Guild Masonry, the Builders, which was taken over in 1717 by Speculative Masonry, which opened the groups to members of other professions. A poem appeared in London in 1723, The Freemasons, a Hudibrastic poem, which rhymed, "If history be not ancient fable, Freemasons came from the Tower of Babel." A tradition was established that a member of the royal family, or someone with close ties to Buckingham Palace, would be named Grand Master of the English Lodges. From 1782, the Duke of Cumberland, the Prince of Wales, and the Duke of Sussex were Grand Masters. The Duke of Sussex was King George III's second son. He married Louise, daughter of the King of Prussia. He later had 2 children by his mistress. They took the family name of Este. Queen Victoria was always proud of her connection with the House of Este, which had begun as the House of Azal. The House of Windsor is the world's preeminent family of reigning monarchs today. They represent the final triumph of the Guelph faction, or Black Nobility, the culmination of the Canaanite drive for power. Their rise had been continuous since the 13th century, when they defeated their most powerful opponents, the Teutonic Hohenstaufen dynasty, who were known as the Ghibelline faction. They had been named after one of the Hohenstaufen strongholds, Wiblingen. Frederick I, Barbarossa, as head of the Hohenstaufens, had extended his rule into northern Italy, where he was surprised by the unexpectedly strong challenge from the Guelph faction. The struggle, which lasted for more than a century, was won by the lower nobility faction of the Guelphs because of their strength among the rising merchant class. The Ghibellines, or high nobility, continued to be the knights on horseback, refusing to sully their hands with trade. The Ghibellines ruled the northern cities of Siena, Milano, and Pisa, while the strength of the Guelphs was centered in Florence and Ferrara. Otto IV of Guelph carried on the fight against Philip of Swabia, a Hohenstaufen, but the Hohenstaufens found themselves outnumbered by the forces of the League of Rhenish Towns, a merchant alliance which was able to raise large sums to outfit the condottieri. By the end of the 15th century, the Guelphs had triumphed. Alfonso I of Este married Lucrezia Borgia. His sister, Mary of Modena, married James II of England, bringing the Este line into the English ruling family. The Ghibellines favored a strong central rule and imperial power, while the Guelphs agitated for decentralized power and the rights of man, a motto which later became their rallying cry for their drive to power. In the 20th century, the surviving heirs of the Guelph and Ghibelline factions were arrayed against each other in 2 world wars. Germany had become a world power through the military instincts and drive of the Prussian Ghibellines. In 1866, Bismarck, to further his goal of unifying Germany, had dispossessed a number of German princes from their estates. The Duke of Nassau and the Elector of Hesse formally renounced their claims, Only the princes of Hanover, who were the heirs to the throne of Brunswick, refused to relinquish their holdings. For decades afterwards, the Hanovers considered themselves to be at war with Prussia. Indeed, 2 world wars did take place, due in part to the continued resentment of the ruling family of England against the rulers of Germany. It is an interesting point that the victorious Hanovers saw to it that a defeated Germany was split into 2 small, militarily occupied countries after World War II, the final revenge of the victors. Calvinism and the rise of the merchants. Calvinism, a strong influence in England during the 16th century, capitalized on the growing power of the mercantile fleet and the black nobility, whose main interest was money. Unlike previous religious institutions, which had placed great emphasis on austerity and vows of poverty, this new religious doctrine stressed that the charging of interest in loans and the amassing of wealth was the new way of doing the work of the Lord. It was a welcome revelation to the growing merchant class that God really wanted us to become wealthy. Enrichez-vous became the new battle cry which swept across Europe as the Canaanites built great commercial empires. The prophet of this new divine revelation was one Jean Cautin of Nantes, France. He was educated in the Collège du Montaigu, where Loyola, founder of the Jesuit sect, had studied. Cautin later moved to Paris, where he continued his studies with the humanists from 1531–32. During his stay in Paris, he was known as Cautin. He then moved to Geneva, where he formulated the philosophy now known as Calvinism. At first known in Geneva as Cohen, the usual pronunciation of Cautin, he anglicized his name to John Calvin. This religious movement was based on a literal Jewish interpretation of the Ten Commandments, Old Testament philosophy, and the prohibition of graven images. The early disciples of Calvinism were known as Christian Hebraists. The advent of Calvinism made possible the great expansion of Jews into further avenues of European commerce besides money lending. For this achievement, the encyclopedia honors Calvin with the statement, "Calvin blessed the Jews." In retrospect, Calvinism can be seen as but one more of the Canaanite movements which have periodically swept across Europe, creating revolutionary plots which were then exported to other countries. It is no accident that with the advent of Calvin, Switzerland became the private banking center of the world, or that the successive revolutionary plots have been both hatched and financed from Switzerland. Even Lenin found a haven in Switzerland during the years of toiling over the techniques which would allow him to seize Russia from the Romanov family, which had ruled that nation for 1,000 years. Calvinism's welcome exhortation to amass more money was counterbalanced from the outset by the fact that it was inaugurated as a brutal, tyrannical system which functioned on the basis of Oriental despotism, again revealing its Canaanite origins. The people of Shem never believe in forcing anyone to do anything. This is a basis of their law. They believe that as a matter of natural instinct, people will always do the right thing. The Canaanites, on the other hand, always aware of the curse on their people, and God's command to the children of Israel to exterminate them, realize that their survival depends on employing the most brutal measures. Calvinism ran true to form. In November 1541, Calvin issued his ecclesiastical ordinances, a body of instructions which imposed absolute discipline on all citizens. Calvin's ordinances imposed the death penalty against any opponent. His leading critic, Jacques Gruet, was beheaded for blasphemy. Another religious opponent, Michael Servetus, was burned at the stake. Other critics were tortured and beheaded. Calvin encouraged the burning of witches and ruthlessly enforced his ordinances, creating the most tyrannical and autocratic theocracy in Europe. The Amsterdam bankers and the overthrow of the Stuarts. The importation of Calvinism into England was calculated to drive a wedge between the Church and state. The traditional Church of England had as its titular head the king. Calvinism's divisive propaganda led to the triumph of Cromwell and the replacement of the kings of the Stuart line by the House of Orange-Nassau. The first victim of this purge was King Charles I, who was beheaded by the conspirators. Details of the plot were published centuries later in Lord Alfred Douglas' publication Plain English, September 3, 1921. L.D. van Valkert came into possession of the missing volumes of the records of the Synagogue of Mulheim, lost since the Napoleonic Wars, which were written in German. These records have the entry, June 6, 1647, from O.C. to Ebenezer Pratt, in return for financial support will advocate admission of Jews to England, this, however, impossible while Charles living. Charles cannot be executed without trial, adequate grounds for which at present do not exist. Therefore, advise that Charles be assassinated, but it will have nothing to do with procuring an assassin, though willing to help in his escape. The reply came from Pratt July 12, 1647, will grant financial aid as soon as Charles removed, and Jews admitted. Assassination too dangerous. Charles should be given an opportunity to escape. His recapture will then make trial and execution possible. The support will be liberal, but useless to discuss terms until trial commences. Lord Alfred Douglas was subsequently imprisoned on a charge of having libeled Winston Churchill in his paper, a feat which most reasonable men would consider impossible. The plot proceeded as outlined by Pratt. On November 12, 1647, King Charles escaped. He was recaptured, and at his subsequent trial, the House sat all night, December 5, 1648, finally agreeing that Charles would negotiate a settlement on terms laid down by them. This resulted in the famous Pride's Purge. Cromwell, infuriated that the House had not passed sentence of execution, dismissed all the members who had favored a settlement with Charles. The 50 members who remained were known as the Rump Parliament. They had usurped absolute power. They then proclaimed a High Court of Justice on January 9, 1649. It was composed of levelers from Cromwell's army. Manasseh ben Israel's agent in England, Isaac Doras Loss, drew up the indictment against King Charles. Manasseh ben Israel, who transmitted the funds from Amsterdam for Cromwell's revolution, is dubbed Cromwell's English intelligencer by the Encyclopaedia Judaica. On January 30, 1657, King Charles was beheaded at Whitehall. Cromwell did not live long to enjoy his triumph. He died in 1661, making it possible for King Charles II to regain the throne. Many of Cromwell's most dedicated revolutionaries emigrated to the American colonies, where they have exercised a pernicious influence ever since. The Cromwellians were the guiding inspiration of the abolitionist movement which precipitated the Civil War. They have been behind-the-scenes figures in many other disasters in the United States. Because Charles II was now on the throne of England, the Amsterdam bankers instituted a great financial depression in England in 1674. The unrest caused by this development paved the way for the House of Nassau to seize the throne of England. England made peace with its nemesis, Holland, in 1677. As part of the deal, William of Orange married Mary, daughter of the Duke of York, who became King James II when Charles II died in 1685. James now became the only obstacle to William's taking over the throne of England. The Amsterdam bankers now launched a frenetic campaign of bribing King James II's leading aristocratic supporters. The first to succumb was the Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill, ancestor of Winston Churchill. As head of the army, Marlborough's support was crucial. He accepted bribes of some £350,000 from de Medina and Machado. Next was Lord Shrewsbury, Charles Talbot, who had occupied high office during the reign of both Charles II and James II. Seeing that the tide was now turning, such luminaries as Sidney Godolphin, the Duke of Sunderland, and the Duchess of Portsmouth secretly went over to those who favored the accession of William of Orange. Meanwhile, James II seemed unaware of the treachery which surrounded him. Marlborough even signed a renewed oath of fidelity to James on November 10, 1688. On November 24, he joined the forces of William of Orange. Sailing with William's invasion force was Lord Polwart, whose descendant, the present Lord Polwart, is prominent in American and English banking and industry. Hans Bentinck, a Dutchman who had nursed William through a bout of smallpox, he named his son William after the king. The Earl of Devonshire was in secret correspondence with William at The Hague. Devonshire agreed to deliver the entire Midlands area to William, after signing a historic letter inviting him to take the throne of England. In the 1930s, his descendant, the Duke of Devonshire, briefly worked for J.P. Morgan in New York. Morgan often referred to him as Lord Useless. The heir to the Devonshire estates married Kathleen Kennedy, daughter of Joseph P. Kennedy. He was killed in action during the war. The Devonshires now faced the bothersome prospect of a Kennedy claim to their estates. The problem was solved when Kathleen Kennedy was killed in an airplane accident while flying to France for a champagne tryst with her lover. Now King of England, William III named Bentinck the first Earl of Portland. The second Duke married into the Cavendish fortune. The third Duke became Governor-General of India and made the history books when he abolished the practice of suttee in 1829. Those who had aided William's invasion were well rewarded. They have been the wealthiest families in England ever since. The first order of business was to charter the Bank of England in 1694, the mission for which William had been backed by the bankers of Amsterdam. This made the Canaanite cause a true world power. William's accession placed the throne of England firmly in the line of the Black Nobility, where it has remained ever since. Lord Shrewsbury became one of the first stockholders in the Bank of England, investing £10,000. He enthusiastically predicted that the Bank of England would not only finance trade, it would also carry the burden of her wars, a prediction which proved true. Because no revolutionary faction could obtain any financing after the Bank of England gained control of the money of England, there has never been another civil war or revolution in England. The Cavendish-Bentinck line, like others who supported William, has always prospered. The present Duke married a Mrs. Quigley of Kentucky and is a director of the Rothschild firm, Rio Tinto. During World War II, he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Intelligence. The Scottish lords to a man had been loyal to James II, to the first to bend the knee to William was one Patrick Lyon. He became Earl of Strathmore. The daughter of the 14th Earl, Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, is now the Queen Mother of England. William III soon had a beautiful mistress, Elizabeth Villiers. He also conducted lengthy love affair with a handsome young nobleman, Arnold van Keppel, whom he named Earl of Albemarle. When William III died, two persons were specifically named at his will, the Earl of Portland, and the Earl of Albemarle. Both received bequests of land and jewels. 19th-century British bankers and statesmen. The Canaanites make sure to reward those who serve them well. Typical was the career of John Buchan, who married Susan Grosvenor. The Grosvenors, Duke of Westminster, are the wealthiest family in England, owning some 600 acres of prime London real estate. For 3 years, Buchan was private secretary to Lord Alfred Milner during Milner's promotion of the Boer War. Milner also founded the Round Tables, the present Council on Foreign Relations. Buchan became a widely published novelist and was named Governor-General of Canada. He was given the title Lord Tweedsmuir. In his autobiography, Pilgrim's Way, Buchan mentions en passant the veiled prophets who are behind the scenes in a crisis. He offers no further identification. He also writes, "I dreamed of a worldwide brotherhood with the background of a common race and creed, consecrated to the cause of peace." In this seemingly innocuous fantasy, he was really citing his dedication to the worldwide Canaanite conspiracy, with its pseudo-program of the rights of man, world brotherhood, and world peace. All this, in reality, the screen for a universal tyranny imposed by the Canaanite despots. The Bank of England was chartered as the result of regicide and an international conspiracy which successfully seized the throne of England. Yet John Buchan wrote in his autobiography, "I had long shared Lord Rosebery's view of him, Oliver Cromwell, as the greatest of Englishmen." Lord Rosebery had been the first of the English aristocrats to marry into the Rothschild family. It was to be expected that he would revere the memory of England's only regicide. The Rothschilds had used the European network of the Illuminati as their transmission belt for their rapid takeover of the continent's financial structure. They used a number of stratagems, a few of which were revealed by Guy de Rothschild in his book, Whims of Fortune. The Rothschilds' correspondence was always written in Hebrew, it was never signed, so that any signature purporting to be from one of the five brothers would be seen to be a forgery. He reports, just after World War I, the French government needed to borrow dollars. They contacted the House of Morgan, who preferred, however, to deal with the Rothschilds rather than with the government. This was a bit of gloating on the part of Rothschild. He knew that the vaunted House of Morgan had never been more than an appendage of the Rothschild network. It was instructed to deal with the House of Rothschild. He also notes, "My family had always been one of the major shareholders in the British Rio Tinto. Traditionally half the capital was French." One of the marks which the Rothschilds left on the world was the traditional red shield of the Salvation Army. In the 19th century, Baron Rothschild began to give considerable sums to General Booth in London, always through an unidentified representative. One day, he came in and revealed that he was the mysterious benefactor. He stated that he would continue his donations, but he would like to make one suggestion. The Salvation Army could attract more attention if perhaps it could adopt some distinctive logo. "What would you suggest?" asked General Booth. "I suppose a red shield would be effective, don't you?" said Baron Rothschild. The Salvation Army carried the red shield all over the world. One of the principal agencies of the Canaanite network has been the Rhodes Trust, which has trained young men in the principles of the Canaanite program for world power for almost a century. Cecil Rhodes was the agent for the Rothschilds when he secured their control over the vast diamond and gold reserves of South Africa. They still exercise control through De Beers, Diamonds, and the Anglo-American Corporation, Gold. Rhodes had considerable holdings himself. When he died, Ford Nathan Rothschild emerged in 1891 as his sole trustee. This control was later expanded to include other members of the Society of the Elect, R. H. Brand of Fizzard Freres, Sir Alfred Bate, another of the Rand millionaires, the Earl of Rosebery, and Sir Alfred Milnor. This group not only set up the Rhodes Trust, it later financed the Royal Institute of International Affairs and its American subsidiary, the Council on Foreign Relations. Canaanite mysticism in England. After gaining control in England, the Canaanites reverted to their traditional practices as demon worshippers. England was soon rife with cults embodying witchcraft, black masses, and blood rituals. The Earl of Pembroke had been an early supporter of William of Orange, and a charter subscriber to the Bank of England. The Countess of Pembroke became a leader of the new mystery cults, with her brother, Sir Philip Sidney, who brought mysticism into English literature with the publication of his Fairy Queen, which he had dedicated to his sister. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, also played an important role in the mystery cults. He was descended from Black Nobility, being descended from both of the bastard sons of the Duke of Normandy, Richard the Fearless. The Gloucesters followed William the Conqueror to England. Mysticism became a dominant theme in English literature of this period. Sir Philip Sidney was specially influenced by Hubert Languet, a French intellectual who openly espoused the rights of man and what is now known as the liberation doctrine. He frequently spoke on the right of people to armed insurrection and the legitimacy of resistance. Sir Philip's father, Sir Henry, had been a protégé of the powerful Cecil family. He later was named President of Ireland. The work of Shakespeare contains many mystical influences, Prosperous Revels, etc. One of England's greatest dramatists, whose work is largely ignored, is Christopher Marlowe. He wrote 3 great plays, all of them devoted to exposing the mystery cult: Dan Burlon, The Jew of Malta, and Dr. Faustus. After completing Dr. Faustus, he died somewhat mysteriously, being stabbed in what was called a quarrel. The Jew of Malta is said to be a dramatization of the career of Dr. Federico Lopez, former physician to the Earl of Leicester. In 1593, Lopez was accused of plotting to poison Queen Elizabeth. He was executed by hanging in 1594. Some scholars maintain that Queen Elizabeth had been secretly married to the Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley, and that they had 2 sons, Sir Francis Bacon, who had been adopted by Sir Nicholas Bacon, and Robert, Earl of Essex. Lopez could have officiated at these births. His silence would protect the succession to the throne. Others claim that Bacon actually was the person who wrote the plays attributed to William Shakespeare. Sir Francis Bacon introduced the new philosophy into England. It was based on the induction theory and the pyramid of knowledge, both of which were mystical concepts. They were the principles of humanism, as stated in a more scientific or plausible form. From 1350 to 1425, the medieval guilds had died out by government decree, due to the aristocracy's fear of demands for higher wages. Bacon began the secret revival of these guilds, first through the Rosicrucian movement, which he is said to have founded, and later through the free and accepted, speculative, Masons. The Rosicrucians, or Knights of the Rose-Croix, flaunted the symbol of a rosy cross. The upright was the symbol of life. The crossbar the symbol of death. The rose symbol was said to mean, first of all, secrecy in all things. And second, the blooming of woman's genitals. The cult was known in Bohemia as early as 1615, where an alchemist, Dr. John Dee, organized its followers. Francis Yates' important work, The Occult Philosophy in the Elizabethan Age, traces some of Bacon's work to the Rosicrucian Manifesto. Yates notes that Marlowe's plays, with their merciless examination of the forces behind mysticism, may have been purposely overshadowed by the more mystical works of Shakespeare. The Jew of Malta touched upon some of the most sensitive court secrets of the Elizabethan Age. Dan Burlon is a play which exposes a Saturnian tyrant whose color was black, Canaanite, and a fulmination against dictatorial power. It may be his greatest work, but it has been shunted aside in favor of Dr. Faustus. This play openly portrays the process by which the demon-worshipping Canaanites, as agents of Satan, pledge themselves to the devil in return for earthly riches and power. Marlowe's play takes up the power of incantations and chants, magical formulae, and shows Dr. Faustus' study, which is decked out with the planets and the signs of the zodiac. On the other hand, Shakespeare shows that he had been heavily influenced by Kabbalistic works, such as Giorgio's De Harmonica Mundi. His Merchant of Venice, although frequently denounced for its supposed anti-Semitism, actually is a powerful plea for racial tolerance. In more recent works, English scholars go to great pains to deny that Sir Francis Bacon ever had any connection with either the Rosicrucian movement or the Freemasons. Because these were highly secret organizations, it seems odd that these scholars could be so positive in their denials. Bacon, who had been given the title, Viscount of St. Albans, became the Lord Chancellor of England. He was later removed from this office because of court intrigues led by Ford Buckingham. The Royal Society of London was founded 34 years after Bacon's death. In 1660, the Bishop of Rochester and the other founders paid official tribute to Bacon's works as the basis of their society. The Oxford English Dictionary offers some notes on the Kabbalists during this period. Scottman asked, "I used to doubt the existence of Kabbalists and Rosicrucians," thought the sub-prior. 1891, Rosy Cross. It is commonly held that there is a close connection between the alchemists and the Rosicrucians. W. Taylor, Monthly Mag. 797, the disciples have formed in churches an esoteric Gnostic or illuminated order, rather than congregations. This quote is important because it shows that the Illuminati were penetrating the established churches. The ninth edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica identifies the missing link between these groups as Ignatius Loyola, who founded the Jesuit order on the Feast of the Assumption on April 15, 1541 near Rome. This date is given by some authorities as 1534. He had formerly been a student at Salamanca. From 1520 on he was a member of an Illuminati sect in Salamanca called Illumberados. In 1527 he was tried by an ecclesiastical commission because of his membership in this sect. He was acquitted. In the Society of Jesus, he set up 6 degrees for advancement, which are the same as in Freemasonry. Its doctrines are similar to those of the Jewish Mishnah, English Freemasonry and Illuminism. 4 lodges met at the Goose and Gridiron Ale House in London on June 24, 1717, to form the first Grand Lodge of England. Jacob Katz, in his book, Jews and Freemasonry in Europe, says that the initial members included Mendez, de Medina, Alvarez, and Baruch, most of whom were Marranos. During Elizabeth's reign, the Rosicrucians had organized themselves as Masons, perhaps under Bacon's guidance. The Encyclopaedia Judaica says that the coat of arms of English Freemasonry was designed by Jacob Jude de Leon Templo. 1717 was the year that the Hanovers ascended the throne of England. Under the leadership of George III's son, the Duke of Sussex, the rival lodges of Ancient and Modern were now joined. The Royal Society's members, who had paid homage to Bacon, joined the Masons through relevant John de Sagaliers, England's second Grand Master. Elijah Ashmole was an important figure in the growth of English Freemasonry. Not only was he an important intellectual figure, he also organized the various mystery cults into the functioning system of Freemasonry. Together, Lord Acton and Ashmole controlled William Pitt's foreign policy, as well as the Royal Society of London, the precursor of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Ashmole's name survives today as the prestigious Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. The growth of Freemasonry in Germany illustrates the power of the Canaanite force which brought the Hanoverian kings to power in England. Its success focused on the career of Adam Weishaupt, born in 1748. At the age of 22, he was elected to the chair of common law at Ingolstadt University. The post had been held by Jesuits continuously since 1750. He founded the Order of the Illuminati on May 1, 1776. The other founders were the Duke of Brunswick, Grand Duke Ernest of Gotha and the Elector of Hesse, whose transaction with King George III to provide Hessian mercenaries to defeat the American revolutionaries was the foundation of the Rothschild fortune. On July 16, 1782, Weishaupt formally combined the Order of the Illuminati with the Freemasons at the Congress of Wilhelmsbad. The combined groups now had over 3 million members, including some of the most powerful men in Europe. Weishaupt was the ideal front man for this organization, because of his ability to formulate ideas and his organizational ability. He wrote, "The Freemasons should control all men of every class, nation, and religion, dominating them without obvious compulsion, uniting them through a strong bond, inspiring them with enthusiasm to spread common ideas, and with the utmost secrecy and energy, direct them towards this singular objective throughout the world. It is through the intimacy of secret societies that these opinions will be formed." Munich, 1765, cited by Berulle. Far from being a starry-eyed idealist or fantasizing intellectual, Weishaupt was backed in his plan for world power by many of the leading Canaanite bankers of Europe, Moses Mendelssohn of Germany, Daniel Litzig of Vienna, Friedlander, Meyer Surfbier, Moses Makata, and the Goldsmith brothers of London, Benjamin, and Abraham. Remaining behind the scenes of Weishaupt's operations, while liberally funding the growth of his movement, They secretly functioned as the Sovereign Patriarchal Council of Hamburg, the Supreme Jewish Lodge. Jacob Katz, Jews and Freemasonry in Europe, Harvard Press, 1970, states that the German Freemasons originated in the Order of the Asiatica, of which the wealthy banker Daniel Itzig was head. Itzig was also the backer of Weishaupt. In 1811, the Frankfurt Lodge of Freemasons was formed by Sigismund Geisenheimer. Geisenheimer was the head clerk of the House of Rothschild, and Rabbi Zvi Hirsch, chief rabbi of Frankfurt. Hirsch later led in the Reform Judaism movement which formulated the political Zionist program. The Frankfurt Lodge listed among its members all of the leading bankers of Frankfurt, the Rothschilds, the Adlers, the Speers, the Hanuers, and the Goldsmiths. They later held joint meetings with the Sanhedrin of Paris. Duke Karl von Hessen of Schleswig then became the head of the German Masons. As Landgrave, he administered the province of Schleswig for its absentee owners, the Danish monarchy. His principal emissary was a mysterious Johnston, variously said to be a Jew named Leicht, Lucht, or Becker. He was arrested while on a mission for the Masonic movement, and he died while held prisoner in the castle of Wartburg. Frederick the Great, while still crown prince, was initiated into Freemasonry in Brunswick in 1738. In 1761, he was named head of the Scottish Rite. As a young man, he had seen his father behead his lover in an attempt to force him to abandon his homosexual practices. The leaders of Freemasonry Illuminati were known as the Order of the Strict Observance. They were Prince Charles of Hesse, Exaleone Resurgenti, and von Flogwitz, Frederick's cabinet minister, known as Examonti Dankti. Behind him were still another group, known as the Invisibles, or the Unknown Superiors, who have been previously identified as the Sovereign Patriarchal Council. From its inception, the alliance of the Illuminati and the Freemasons had a clearly defined program: 1. Abolition of all ordered government. 2. Abolition of private property. 3. Abolition of inheritance. 4. Abolition of patriotism. 5. Abolition of all religions. 6. Abolition of family, morality, and control of education of children. 7. Creation of a world government. This program may seem familiar to the reader. It has been encountered as the working instructions for every revolutionary movement in the world since 1782. Communism, liberation movements, resistance fighters, all obtain their program from this basic plan. It also states the goals of secular humanism in its attack on the family and the plan to control the education of children. Because messages were constantly being carried to and fro from the various chapters of the Illuminati, these instructions were seized from captured couriers and became known to European governments. Even then, no action was taken, possibly because of accomplices in high places. Also, there was an important stumbling block to convincing the threatened populations of the menace of the Illuminati revolutionists. This was the dominant presence of many of the world's most powerful bankers at the heart of the conspiracy. It was too much to ask the average official, or even a member of the public, to believe that the world's most prominent aristocrats, landholders, and bankers would be backing a program of this type. Surely bankers would not advocate the seizure of private property. Surely aristocrats would not abolish the right of inheritance. Surely landholders with vast acreage would not advocate the nationalization of all land. The problem was that no one understood that this was the program of the Canaanites, which was intended solely to rob and enslave the people of Shem. Of course, the Canaanite bankers did not intend to seize their own property. Of course the Black Nobility did not intend to nationalize their own inheritances. The Illuminati program nowhere states that this is the plan designed to overcome the curse of Canaan, that the Illuminati plan merely formalizes the will of Canaan as a working set of instructions. The admonition of Canaan to his heirs to love robbery hate your masters was now the program of a worldwide group of conspirators. The people of Shem remain convinced that bankers do not finance communism, and that wealthy people will not give up their holdings. The Illuminati communist plan continues the battle of the Canaanites against the people of Shem. Until they realize this, the people of Shem remain doomed to destruction. From the Illuminati headquarters at Frankfurt came the twin Canaanite evils which have since plagued the world, Zionism and communism. The first communist international was composed of Lionel de Rothschilds, Heinrich Heine, and Karl Marx. Weishaupt had died in 1830, at the age of 82. He was succeeded as head of the Illuminati by Giuseppe Mazzini, the Italian revolutionary leader. Under Mazzini's leadership, the Illuminati moved rapidly toward a policy of more direct action, of revolutionary outbreaks and open attempts to seize and overthrow governments. The Communist International was the first step in this program of activism. At first it was simply known as the League of the Just, a branch of the Illuminati. This group commissioned Karl Marx to write the Communist Manifesto in 1847. It was published in 1848 and was immediately given worldwide circulation by the international offices of Freemasonry. Throughout his long political career, Marx was known to work actively with both the Jesuits and the Freemasons. In 1864, Marx organized the International Workingmen's Party in London. In 1872, he moved it to New York, where it was merged with the Socialist Party. Marx received a regular stipend from American newspapers as a columnist, employment which had been arranged for him by the Freemasons. Mazzini appointed General Albert Pike head of American Freemasonry in 1860. Pike had only joined the Masons 10 years earlier. On January 22, 1870, Mazzini wrote to Pike of his plan to establish a supreme governing council of secret Masons of high degree, who would govern all of Freemasonry. However, no federation of Masons would ever be allowed to know about the Supreme Council, a precept which remains in force today. Most Masons will emphatically deny that such a council exists anywhere in their organizational structure. Known as the New and Reformed Palladian Rite, it consisted of 3 supreme councils, with headquarters in Charleston, Rome, and Berlin. The chiefs of these 3 councils communicated daily by their Arcula Mystica magic box, which was actually an early development of radio. At that time, there were only 7 such boxes in existence throughout the world. The Zionist movement and the protocols. The other arm of the worldwide revolutionary movement was Zionism, which aimed to enlist the international force of the Jews in a campaign to establish a state of Israel as the world's supreme ruling power. Since this was also the avowed purpose of Freemasonry, to rebuild the Temple of Solomon, and to fill it with all of the wealth of the world, Zionism's initial appearance came through Freemasonry. It was first known as Reform Judaism. Greet's History of the Jews, v. 5, p. 674, states that, the first Jewish Freemason lodge, at Frankfurt on Main, was the heart of the Jewish Reform movement. In 1842, the Society of Friends of Reform, Judaism, at Frankfurt issued its principles: 1. The denial of the legal authority of the Babylonian Talmud, substituting for it instead the Old Testament. 2. The denial that the Messiah would lead them back to Jerusalem. 3. Temple service was to be conducted in the vernacular. 4. Women could now be allowed to sit beside men in the synagogue, instead of being segregated, as had always been required by Orthodox Judaism. Reform Judaism launched a number of programs besides Zionism. Ecumenism, that is, active cooperation with leaders in congregations of other faiths. Feminism, equality of the sexes, but their most important concept, that the Messiah would never appear on earth to lead them back to Jerusalem, opened the door for the seeking of this goal by political activism, that is, Zionism. The initial program of political Zionism was first broached by Rabbi Hirsch Kalischer, a close associate of Meyer Amschel Rothschild in Frankfurt. Sir Moses Montefiore and Adolphe Kremux, founder of the Alliance Israelite Universelle, gave added impetus to the new movement. Its goals were greatly publicized by the work of Moses Hess, a close friend of Karl Marx. This is ironic, in view of the fact that the present Soviet government professes to be ideologically opposed to Zionism. Moses Hess became known as the father of Zionism. A journalist who was greatly influenced by his writings, Theodor Herzl, was converted to activism, and he is now known as the founder of the Zionist state. The Encyclopedia Judaica says that Moses Hess was a Jewish socialist and nationalist who led the Reform movement, calling for the colonization of Palestine. His principal work, Rome and Jerusalem, which received wide circulation, was the book which had great impact on Theodor Herzl. In 1860, Rabbi Kalischer hosted a secret meeting at his home in Thorn to recap the lessons which had been learned from the Revolution of 1848. This revolution had been intended to topple all the governments of Europe and replace them with communist governments. It succeeded in only a few isolated instances, such as Venice, where Daniel Manini set up a communist government. From the Thorn meeting came Kalischer's book, Drishul Zion, in 1861, and later, Moses Hess' Rome and Jerusalem. These two works were largely responsible for converting the Jews of Europe to the Zionist program, the political goal of restoring Palestine to the Jewish people. One of the conspirators present at this 1860 meeting leaked the record of the proceedings to a writer named Maurice Joly. The culprit is reputed to have been one Élie Harain, a confidant of Adolphe Crémux, head of the influential Alliance Israélite Universelle. A power in French politics, Crémux had obtained for Harain the post of private secretary to Napoleon III. Joly later published the proceedings under the title, Dialogue aux Frères entre Machiavelli et Montesquieu. The earliest version of the book now circulated under the title, Protocols of Zion. The material paralleled much of the text of Kalischer's book, Drishul Zion, and with the rabbi's speech delivered by Goetz in 1868. It also coincided with the proceedings of the Jewish Synod of Leipzig of 1869. The Catalites Conference of Zion 1884 also coincides with the first set of documents which appeared as the Protocols of Zion. The Catalites papers had been extracted from the Mizraim Lodge of Paris by one Joseph Stuarts Shapiro. He sold them to Emile Justine de Glinka, who forwarded them to the Russian Ministry of the Interior, where they were received by a General Ordzky. Shortly afterward, Stuarts Shapiro was murdered in Egypt. The Odessa Conference of Zion and B'nai Moshe, led by Asht Ginsburg, Ahad Hem, and his subsequent stay in Paris in 1894, were followed by the appearance of the Protocols as they are now known. They were published by Philip Stepwoff in Moscow. This essentially was the same set of documents later published by Sergei Nilus in 1905. Extracts of lectures read at B'nai B'rith lodges in New York at secret meetings were also extracted and put in the hands of the Russian Consul General in New York. These extracts coincided on all points with the 1895 version of the Protocols and those extracted from the First Bow Congress in 1897. They were also published by B. Budmy in 1901. It was because of these well-established antecedents that the Protocols were denounced as forgeries, that is, as unauthorized copies. Influential British Freemasons. Because of its well-advertised revolutionary program, Freemasonry has been repeatedly banned by European governments, but never in the United States, where it has exercised political power since 1776. It has been repeatedly denounced by the papacy. Holland banned Freemasonry in 1735, Germany in 1738, Zurich in 1740, Bern in 1745. Russia first banned Freemasonry in 1792, again in 1822, and by the Soviet government in 1922. On April 28, 1738, Pope Clement VII issued an Eminenti, which condemned Masonry for its naturalism and its demand for oaths. Benedict XIV condemned Masonry in his Providence Edict, May 18, 1751, Pius VII in Ecclesiam, September 13, 1821, Leo XIII, Quo Gravioro, March 13, 1825, Gregory XVI, Mrari, August 15, 1832, Pius IX, and 6 separate edicts dating from 1846 to 1873, Leo XIII, 5 edicts condemning Freemasonry from 1882 to 1902. General Pike responded by terming the papacy a deadly, treacherous enemy in his letter to the Italian Grand Master Timoteo Riboli. The papacy has been for 1,000 years the torturer and curse of humanity, the most shameless imposture, in its pretense to spiritual power of all ages. Despite these edicts, the Catholic Duke of Norfolk became Grand Master of English Masons in 1730, the Catholic Viscount Montague, the 9th Lord Better, who was the head of English Catholics, was also the Grand Master of England from 1770–77. On March 19, 1902, in the 5th of his edicts condemning Freemasonry, Pope Leo XIII said, "Freemasonry is the personification of the Revolution, whose aim is to exercise an occult overlordship upon society and whose sole raison d'etre consists in waging war against God and His Church." What a pity that Pope Leo XIII did not know about the curse of Canaan, or that Freemasonry was simply Satan's rebellion against God, which was being carried on in the 20th century by his descendants, the Canaanites. The heads of English Masonry during the 19th century were the Duke of Sussex, younger son of King George II, 1813–43, the Earl of Zetland, 1843–70, the Marquis of Ripon, 1870, the Earl of Limerick, 1871, the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, 1874, Hugh David Sandeman, of the prominent wine importing family, 1895, Lord Amtil, 1908, the Duke of Connaught, to 1938. These were all leading aristocrats. The Earl of Zetland married the daughter of the Earl of Scarborough, later appointed Viceroy of Ireland 1889–92. He was the brother-in-law of the Duke of Westminster, the wealthiest man in England. The second Marquis of Zetland, Lawrence Dundas, bore the sword of state at the coronation of King George VI. He was also Governor of the National Bank of Scotland, Chairman of the National Trust, Governor of Bengal. He headed the Round Table Conferences of 1930–32, was Secretary of State for India 1935–40, was admitted to the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, and he wrote the biographies of England's 2 leading figures, Lord Cromer, head of Baring Brothers Banking House, and Lord Curzon, Governor-General of India. The Marquis of Ripon, George Frederick Samuel, was born at 10 Downing Street while his father was Prime Minister. He became Secretary of War and Secretary for India under Lord Palmerston, and was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty under Gladstone. He was Colonial Secretary 1892–95, Lord Privy Seal in the House of Lords, and leader of the Liberal Party, 1905–08. His name is memorialized in the United States by the Ripon Society, a group of liberal Republicans who have exercised considerable influence from behind the scenes on the policies of the Republican Party. The present Earl of Limerick, Patrick Perry, is Deputy Chairman of the International Banking House, Kleinward Benson. The second Marquis of Ripon resigned as Grand Master in 1894 and joined the Catholic Church. He was Treasurer of Queen Alexandra's household, wife of King Edward VII 1901–1923. He was brother-in-law to the Earl of Pembroke, and he married the widow of the 4th Earl of Lonsdale. Lord Amtil's father, Odo W. Russell, served in Lord Palmerston's office from 1850–52. He served with the Florence legation from 1857–70 and was regarded as an unofficial ambassador to the Vatican during those years. He was then sent as special envoy to the German army headquarters in Versailles during the Franco-Prussian War. He later served as British ambassador to Vienna and Berlin. The second Baron Amtil was Grand Master of English Masons from 1908 to his death in 1935. This is the same Russell family which holds the title of the Dukes of Bedford, including Bertrand Russell, the most famous humanist of the 20th century. The second Baron was born in Rome while his father was serving there. He became president of the Oxford Union. He married the daughter of the Earl of Beauchamp. Her father held the title of Lord of the Cinque Ports. His wife was Lady-in-Waiting to Queen Mary. He was also a brother-in-law of the Duke of Westminster, joined the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, and served as Grand Master of the lodge which had been formed at the Bank of England, Lodge No. 263. He wrote the history of the Bank of England Lodge and was appointed head of the Masons of Madras, India. Before becoming Grand Master of England, he served as private secretary to Honourable J. Chamberlain, Governor of Madras and Viceroy of India. The backgrounds of these Grand Masters prove that English Freemasonry has always had access to the highest circles of government. Disraeli, a Freemason, became Prime Minister. He referred to determined men of Masonry, meaning those Masons who were assigned to carry out the crucial tasks of assassination. One of the Canaanites who became renowned as a leading English economist, and still enjoys wide influence in the United States, was David Ricardo, 1772–1823, the third son of Abraham Israel, who was a substantial member of the Jewish community in Amsterdam. Israel emigrated to London with William III and later became one of the wealthiest members of the London Stock Exchange, where he worked closely with his fellow émigrés. His son, David, became an intimate friend of Lord Nathan Meyer Rothschild, speculating heavily in government securities on advice of Rothschild. Together, they profited enormously from the financial coup resulting from early news about the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo. David Israel, now known as David Ricardo, began to write economic dicta intended to become the final word on how much the working class should be paid. He developed a formula which became known as the subsistence wage, dictating that the worker should never receive more than the bare minimum needed for his subsistence. If his wages were to be increased, the government was charged to take care of it by promptly increasing his taxes. Does this sound familiar to any Americans? The Canaanites in America developed a new twist with the withholding tax, which ensured that the worker would never receive his wages in the first place. He would only receive a mutilated portion, from which the Canaanites had already deducted their portion. Ricardo's dictum, which also became known as the Iron Law of Wages, iron meaning that under no circumstances would the worker ever be the beneficiary of any outburst of generosity and be allowed even a small increase. When Rita Ricardo Campbell, wife of the director of the Hoover Institution, and a direct descendant of David Ricardo, came to Washington as a key member of Reagan's staff, the Reagan anti-communist, humanitarian revolution, she became Reagan's advisor on Social Security payments and pensions. Ricardo's economic theories on wages and labor had also been enthusiastically received by Karl Marx, who adopted them as the guidelines by which the slave workers of Soviet Russia are ruled today. Stephen Knight's book, The Brotherhood, reveals many interesting details about English Freemasonry. He points out that the Unlawful Societies Act of 1799 required that Freemasons could hold meetings only if the names of the members were submitted to the local clerks of the peace. This requirement has never been complied with. Knight says that Queen Elizabeth is the present Grand Patroness of English Freemasonry. One of his most startling revelations is the information that from 50 to 70% of all English judges are Freemasons. Lawyers find that they must join the Freemasons if they expect to get any clients. The Law Society is one of the most Masonic institutions in the world, notes King. 90% of its members are Masons. This creates great inequities, because the Law Society is the final judge as to who will receive legal aid and who will be denied it. A non-Mason has no chance of receiving legal aid in a suit against a Mason. This is typical of the will of Canaan, the secret conspiracy against all who are not members of the tribe. Cabalism and the Black Arts. The Masonic conspiracy, which casts a pall over legal procedures in England, is but one manifestation of its sinister influence. During the Elizabethan Age, the fascination with the occult appeared in many underground organizations. It now surfaced in the Victorian Age. Witchcraft became widespread, even in the highest circles of society, with its rituals emphasizing mind-altering drugs, plants, and satanic jewelry. Orgies and blood sacrifices were discreetly carried out in the heart of the London slums, and on remote ancestral estates. One of the more publicized of these groups was the Hermetic Society of the Golden Dawn, founded in 1887 by 3 members of the Rosicrucian Society. All 3 were Masons of high degree, and well known as Cabalists: Reverend A.F.A. Woodford, Dr. Owen Westcott, a London coroner, and a Scot named Sam Liddell Mathers. The group was soon joined by William Butler Yeats, the poet, and Aleister Crowley, who was to become known worldwide for his practice of black magic. The purpose of the Hermetic Society was to worship the Ten Sephirith, that is the Kabbalah, so that they could then be endowed with magic powers, and could call on supernatural forces as their allies. The members set up degrees as follows: Neophyte, 4 degrees, Underorder, 4 degrees, and the Third Order, 4 degrees. Yeats, the leading Irish poet, later claimed that he had joined the group in order to counter the black magic of Crowley with his own white magic. Crowley is famed as the most dedicated Satanist of the 20th century. He once baptized a toad with the name of Jesus Christ, and then slowly crucified it, reveling in its agonies. He is said to have taken part in 150 ritual murders, most of whom were children. The victims were usually killed with a silver knife. In his Confessions, he writes, "In Mexico I was known by the name of Beast 666. I had an introduction to an old man named Don Jesus Medina, a descendant of the great Duke of Armada fame, and one of the highest chiefs of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. My Kabbalistic knowledge being already profound by current standards, he thought me worthy of the highest initiation in his power to confer. Special powers were obtained in view of my limited sojourn, and I was rushed rapidly through and admitted to the 33rd and last degree before I left the country." Thus the leading Satanist of this century was confirmed as a 33rd degree Mason. Madame Blavatsky became famous as the organizer of Theosophy. She developed the society after a sojourn in India. The Indian chapters later came under a cloud because of the arrest of its members for the practice of homosexuality. She then moved to Great Britain, where she founded the Theosophical Society there, the precursor of the American group of that name. She also founded the Hermetic Society. Her chief assistant in the Theosophical Society, a Kabbalistic organization, was Mrs. Annie Besant, who is also well known as one of the founders of the Fabian Society in 1884. The co-founders of the Fabian Society were all Freemasons. They were George Bernard Shaw, Lord Haldane, Ramsay MacDonald, and Sidney and Beatrice Webb. The group took its name from the Roman general Fabius, who was celebrated for his deliberate and long-range strategy. The Fabian plan was to wait, as Fabius Cunctator had waited to attack Hannibal, to wait for the right moment. In England, the Fabians proposed to use the Roman general's strategy to gradually impose a tyrannical socialist government upon the people of England through devious long-range planning. This conspiratorial approach won for the Fabians the nickname, the Jesuits of Socialism. As part of their strategy, in 1890, Annie Besant became the chief agitator in the English textile industry, which was centered in Lancashire. During the 1930s, the Fabians organized a strike force called PEP, the initials of Political and Economic Planning. It was headed by Israel Moses Seif, the multimillionaire head of the giant retail empire, Marks & Spencer. In 1931, Seif distributed a document to leading members of PEP, which was labeled strictly confidential. The program outlined included such items as: whether we like it or not, The individualist farmer will be forced by events to submit to far-reaching changes of outlook and methods. He will receive instructions as to the quantity and quality of his produce. He will be less free to make marketing and arbitrary decisions as to his own business. Planned economy must clearly involve drastic increases and inroads upon the right of ownership of land. What is required is transfer of ownership of large blocks of land. This program of PEP was later presented as a textbook drawn up by G.D.H. Cole, Principles of Economic Planning, in 1935. The book featured the compass and the square of Freemasonry prominently emblazoned on the cover, although nothing in the book identified the role of Freemasons in the program. The wealthy directors of PEP did not intend to transfer ownership of their own large blocks of land, or of the business empires which they controlled. They merely wished to take over large blocks of land from their competitors, to force ruinous regulations upon their rivals, in short to rob and ruin everyone but their own small coterie of Canaanites. The most active leaders of PEP were such luminaries as Viscount Astor, Sir Herbert Samuel, Governor of Palestine, Sir Herbert Simon, Sir C.M. Joad, Professor Gilbert Murray, and the Master of Balliol. All of them were Freemasons and members of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, as well. They were closely allied with a group called the World Fellowship of Faiths. The Second International Congress of this group, which met in London in 1936, included among the speakers Canaan Barry, chaplain to King Edward VIII, and ex-Bishop Montgomery Brown. Brown told the audience, "The USSR is just the forerunner of the international communist state which will gradually absorb all capitalist states. If any government, church, or institution opposes or stands in the way of the communist state, they must be ruthlessly overthrown and destroyed. If world unity is to be attained, it must be through international communism, which can only be arrived at by the slogan, 'Banish the gods from the skies and the capitalist from the earth.' Then, and only then, will there exist a complete world fellowship of faiths." This is a concise statement of the ambitions of the international Canaanite conspiracy. Banish the gods. Satan's rebellion against God. The curse of Canaan had not altered its slogans in 3,000 years of recorded history. Rabbi Ben Moshe told the World Fellowship, "What is certain is that Masonic theology is only theosophy at bottom, and corresponds to that of the Kabbalah. Those who will take the trouble to examine with care the connection between Judaism and philosophic Freemasonry, theosophy, and the mysteries in general, will cease to smile at the suggestion that the Kabbalistic theology may have a role to play in the religious transformation of the future. It contains the key to the modern religious problem." Here again, we are offered the solution to all problems by the Canaanites: return to the worship of Baal, brought up to date in the 20th century, and we enter a religious transformation.